Okay, in this video I'm going to cover installation of the UBHSM connector service. It's a part of the SDK that Yubico provides for working with the UBHSM, and it's not necessary to have it, but it's going to help you get more familiar with the UBHSM. The way that you would find it, and I'll go through it on each of the installs, but if you come out to developer.yubico.com, click on UBHSM, go to releases, you'll see all the different releases that they have for the different operating systems. There's a few that we're going to cover here, but the other thing I want you to look at is product overview. And if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you'll see the different files that what comes in the SDK. I'm only going to be covering, or I'm really going to heavily focus on the UBHSM connector service. That's the one that you'll have on most of your Linux boxes. There's also another one down here, an MSI file for the Windows box. But I'm only going to cover the connector service. I will be using the UBHSM shell from one of my test boxes to verify the connection to the HSM. So you may want to go ahead and install that on a box so you can follow along if you want to for the remote connection. There's some other files here that might be helpful. UBHSM setup, this does some automation for you. And just some of the other files here if you're into PKCS11 interfacing. These files are all going to be included in the SDK. So with that being said, let's get started. Okay, in this section I'm going to talk about a configuration file that I created to start up the HSM service on my Linux boxes. I don't have this running on my Windows boxes, but I do show this running on the Mac OS install, the Raspberry Pi, and the Ubuntu install. But really quick, I just wanted to cover some of the details here so we don't have to cover it over and over throughout the video. So the script files that you'll see me create are going to be the hsm_list.config. This is where I just keep all my configuration information for that particular system, which will provide me, in this configuration you can see here, I have two different HSMs that I want to configure. The first, or one of the lines needs to have the connector path, and this will be to whatever service is starting up. And for each individual HSM, it's going to be HSM1 or HSM2, and then the serial number of that HSM and the listening IP and port number that you want it to listen to. That IP address, you can change that to anything you want. If you want it to be just a local host IP of 127.0.0.1, you can do that. Most of my systems, you'll see that I use 0.0.0.0, which listens to all IP addresses on the system. So now, once you have that configuration file, this file stays the same on all of my systems, startup_HSM, and this file should have the executable parameters set for it so you can start it up. It will read in that configuration file, that's what that first line is, and you can see that by default here it needs to be in the same directory as that file so it can read it in. Then it's going to cycle through the individual lines here for how many HSMs you have configured on that system. This bottom line here is kind of the key line to start up the process, and it's going to run the connector service with the -- listen, the port number that it's going to listen in on, IP and port number, and then the serial number that should be listening in on that. After you execute this script, you can take a look at the processes running on the machine, and you should see this line in that process list. But you don't need this script, but it's just something that's helpful. You could also create a systemd file that as the system starts up, it will execute this startup HSM script. We might show that a little bit later, but let's go on to the rest of the installs. Okay, in this section I'm going to talk about installing the connector service on an Ubuntu box. So here, the box that I'm trying to install this on is called Pelican. the first thing I need to do is log in with the root account, and that's so I can add a new user. The way that I run this is with a service account. Here I'm creating a new service account with the password disabled and the ability removed for being able to log in directly with this service account. So I'm just going to take some default information here. And then the next thing I need to do is I need to figure out what operating system version that I'm on. And I will run a command here to be able to pull that from the system. lsb_release -a. This will tell me that I'm operating on Ubuntu 20.04 LTS. I'm going over to the Yubico site to download on the releases pages. What I'm doing here is I'm downloading the entire SDK for Ubuntu. So I'm going to go grab the URL. And I'm gonna put this into the new service accounts directory that I created. This is just to keep all the files in one location. Not necessary, but it's the way that I do my installation. So here I go ahead and unpackage it. And I'm gonna go into the SDK directory and you're gonna see all the installation files available here. I'm only going to install the connector service. It's the only thing that I need for my installation. There are other libraries here that you could download or install on the system. I only need the connector service for my installation, and it'll pull in all the other necessary packages that it needs. So it's gone through the installation here. And the next thing I need to do, and this is an important, and this will catch you up if you're not familiar with it, but this is the UDEV rules. This allows because I'm using a service account and it's not the root user account, it needs to have these rules to allow it access to the USB. So here I'm going into the libudevrules.d directory, which there is a rule created here by default whenever you install the connector service on Ubuntu. This is from Yubico. The reason that I'm making a copy of this into another directory is so that I can override it. The system will read this rule first, but then it will read the rule that I'm creating in the etc udev directory and overwrite the rules. And you'll see here, I'm going to go into the new file that I created and I'm going to modify some information. Only one part of the UDEV rule that I need to modify, and that's the account. By default, Yubico, when it installs their UDEV file, it's going to use the UBHSM connector service name. I'm going to remove that and I'm going to rename it SVCHSM, which is what we created as our service account. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of that file. I will come in and now I need to get the serial number for the HSM that's plugged in to the system. So here using LSUSB, I can find a list of the HSMs that are plugged into the machine. To get more information like the serial number, I'm going to do a -S with the you'll see 001 is the bus, and then the device area that it's plugged in is 002. And verbose information, and then grep out the serial number. If you want to see all the information, you can leave off the grep and you'll get all the information for it. But I'm going to go ahead and copy off that serial number because I need to put that into that config file that I talked about earlier. And that's going to be the next thing that we do. So when we create that, we're going to switch into the service account. We're getting out of the root account. The rest of this can be done with the service account. I'm going to change into that directory here. The first thing I need to do is I need to find out where the connector service was installed. So using the which command, I can see that it's in user bin. I'm going to copy that path and I'm going to start creating my config file for my startup script. That's hsm_list.config. First line that I'm going to put here is the connector path. And I will paste in that path that we just copied, and then I will now paste in the serial number that I grabbed for that HSM. And then the next thing that the command needs is the IP and port number to listen in on. So here I'm just going to set it to all zeros, which will listen to all IP addresses on the machine, and listening on port 2222. Next, I need the startup script, and this is just a simple copy paste from the GitHub repo. I'll paste that in here. Nothing needs to be changed in this file. The only thing that we need to do is add on the executable attribute to that file so it can start up. And next, we need to reboot the system. The reason we need to reboot is to make sure that those UDEV rules fully take effect on the system. So I've gone through and rebooted the system. I'm back in on Pelican and logging into the root account because I can't log in directly to the service account. So I have to go into the root account and then log into the service account. So here I'm going to change in that directory, and then I'm just going to execute that startup HSM script. Run the PS command to see what processes are running, grepping out just for UB, and you can see here that the UB connector service has started up. So the last thing we need to do is just test if we can connect to it from a remote box. So I have another box here called Whale that I use as my test box. This has the UB shell installed on it, but you can do this if you have it installed on Windows or any other box. Here I'm going to log into Pelican on port 2222, connecting with the default. The HSM was reset the default, so using section open 1 and a default password, and just to make sure I can list the objects, and we're good to go. Okay, in this part of the video, I'm going to cover installation of the UBHSM on a Raspberry Pi. Here I have a Pi Zero with a daughter board on it that has the USB ports, and there's two UBHSMs that are plugged into it. Now, Yubico does not provide the binaries to install on Raspberry Pi, so you're going to have to build those yourselves. I may have another video that walks through the build process. It's fairly simple, but you do have additional work that you have to do there. So here we're kicking off. The top part of the screen is going to be Guppy, which is logged into the Raspberry Pi, and I'm going through creating that service account. Because we're not using binaries to install the UBHSM, we're having to create some files from scratch, and one of those files is going to be the UDEV rule to be able to allow our service account to have access directly to the UBHSM on the USB port. This is a security measure. The root user, if you're running all of this as root, you're not going to have to worry about the UDEV rule, but because we're using a service account, you need to make sure that you have this UDEV rule in place. And the second line is really the line that gets highlighted here because you have to specify the account name that you created. And here the owner or the service account that I'm using is going to be the SVC HSM account. So once that file is created, we're gonna drop back down to the system, and the next thing that we need to do is get the serial number, and we do that with LSUSB. That will provide us a list of all attached USB devices, and you can see here that I have the two UBHSMs that are plugged in. Now we need the serial number from the USB details, and the way that we do that is with the LSUSB command, but using the verbose and grepping out the serial number. So we'll grab those serial numbers, we'll hold those over to the side. We're going to need those for our configuration file that we'll build out, that will allow us to start the HSM with a script. So now we have those serial numbers. Let's see, we're gonna change into our service account, and I'm gonna copy over the binary that I've already stored in the temp directory. It's just one file, ubhsm-connector, and I'm going to copy that to the home directory for the service account. So now that we have that there, what I'll do is I will start creating the config file, and the first one is the connector path. Now the connector path is to that file that we just copied over to the home directory. So I need to make sure I put the path to that binary that I just copied here. So that's going to be home svc hsm / ubhsm-connector. And then we'll go ahead and we'll create the lines for the two HSMs that we have on here. Of course, we need to put the serial number of the HSM. I'm going to go and copy that over. And we will go ahead, and the next line will be the IP address and the port number. Again, I will use the 000 mask. That listens to all IP addresses on the system, and this is going to listen on port 1111. We'll go ahead and put that second HSM in here as well, and we'll be able to see the configuration of that a little bit later as well. And because this script kicks off individual processes, when we do look at the processes, you're going to see two processes running, and you'll see the serial number for each one along with the port number that serial number is listening in on. Next, we'll create the actual startup script. So startup_HSM, and copy and paste that information in here. Again, this is a file you don't change. It just executes using the config file that's in the same directory. We're going to restart the system so we can get the UDEV rules and everything all refreshed on the system. We're logged back in, and we're going to go ahead, and again, we can't log in directly to our service account, so we're going to go to root, and then we'll trigger over to our SVC HSM user account. So here, the first thing that we need to do is we need to add the execution attribute onto the startup HSM script so we can start that. And here we go, we start it, and now we can look at the processes, and you'll see here that there's multiple processes running for the UBHSM connector, and which serial number is listening in on what port number. So now that we have that, we're going to jump over to our remote system, and we're going to try to connect to the HSM just to see if we can connect to them from a remote system with those port numbers that we have set, and see if we can list off the objects. Now there is a status URL that you can also go to let you know the status. I like to do these steps just so I can make sure I can get into the HSM and run a few commands. And you can see here my one HSM has a couple objects on it. It actually had an asymmetric key on it along with the default auth key. And we're going to connect to the second HSM, and it looks like everything connected fine. We have the session keep alive good and able to log in, and we'll do a list objects here just to make sure. And then we should be good to go. Yeah, and it looks like everything's good. Okay, in this section I'm going to install on a Mac. I have an M1 MacBook Pro that I'm installing on. So that's going to be the ARM package. So I find that on the Yubico's website. I've already downloaded, so we're going to go through and go through the install process. It's pretty straightforward on a Mac. It's executing the installation of the package. It's going to ask you for your password to be able to authenticate the installation. But you just go through the install. And this will install the complete package. So it won't only be the connector service, it'll be all the additional tools that come along with the installation for the SDK. So here it's asking me to authenticate myself. And we'll go ahead and close all of this out and exit. And then we'll move on to the next step of creating a directory. What I like to do is I like to create a directory to keep all my config files in. It's separate from my other directories. So I go ahead here and I create a UBHSM directory, and now I need to find out the location of where that connector is. So here it looks like it's installed in user local bin. So then I will create the config file that we've used on some of the other systems as well. And I'm going to have to first specify the connector path. So that'll be that path that I just grabbed from the which command. So I'll just do a copy paste. I want to make sure I got that right. There we go. And then next I'm going to have to do the configuration for each of the HSMs. So I need to get the serial number from the USB. So here, using System Profiler, I can call and find out the information on that HSM. You can copy that command where I grep for the UBHSM to be able to get that serial number. So we're going to do that, and we're going to go back to our config file and add it in. And that's going to be underneath HSM1_serial. Taking me a little while to get to the editor. And we'll go ahead and add that line in. And we'll also put in the port, IP and port. Again, I use the kind of wildcard of 0000 with the port number on, I think this one, yeah, 5555. All right, and once that's executed, next what we need to do is we need to create the actual startup script. So again, this is the just copy paste the script, because this script will utilize that config file that we just pulled in to be able to start up the processes. Next, we'll have to add on the execute attribute to the startup script and execute it. At this point, we should be able to check the processes and see that the process is running for that serial number on that port, and it's underneath the user that we're running as. So we're good to go there. Next, we need to verify the entire connection of the system. So I need to find out what my IP address is because I don't have a DNS record for this computer. And I see that it's going to be 148. I'm going to go over to my remote system whale and use the UBHSM shell command to make a connection to this system. Now, one of the things that you might run into, I'll just kind of talk over this as it connects into it. You may have some firewall. If this doesn't connect and you get some errors, the next thing to do would be trying it locally on the Mac to see if you can connect to it to make sure everything's running fine. But if you do start to have some connection challenges, with the Mac, you're probably going to have the firewall enabled at that point. You're going to have to go into that firewall. What I've done is I go into the firewall and I allow the UBHSM-connector application access to the network, and you can easily select that in the list, and then that provides that remote access into the system. But that's the only challenge that I had getting this one set up on a Mac. Everything's pretty straightforward. Okay, in this section, what I'm going to walk through is installation on a Windows machine. I have a Surface Pro here that has Windows 11 installed on it, and it's all patched. I'm going to download the Windows zip file that's on the Yubico's website. And the first thing I need to do is extract that file that I downloaded. This will contain all of the installation files for the UBHSM connector and some of the tools that they provide as well for it. I'm going to go into the directory, and there's only one file that I'm going to execute here, and that's going to be the connector file. You can experiment with the other files here. The only thing I'm walking through on this video is installing and configuring the connector service, which is the basic thing that you need. You do need to be administrator on the box to be able to run this installation. So we went ahead and did that. The next thing I need to do is I need to open up a PowerShell as administrator. So I'm going to right click on PowerShell to make sure I can open up as administrator, because I need to modify some configuration files. But first, what I need to do is use a WMI command to be able to find out the serial number of the USB device that's plugged in. So with this command here, I'm looking for UBHSM, and it comes back, and you can verify that it's an HSM because the VID, which is the vendor ID, is 1050, which is for Yubico, and the PID, or the product ID, of 0030 would be for the UBHSM. I'm going to grab the serial number, and next I'm going to open up that configuration file and program data UBHSM. This is installed by Yubico, so it's by default it's going to be there after the install. And I'm going to open that up in Notepad. I'm going to first copy into the clipboard the serial number, because I'm going to need that inside the configuration file. So I will open up the YAML file, and first thing I'll do is I'll modify the listen IP and port number. This is slightly different than what we did on the Linux boxes. This is just for the Windows machines. So we'll put the serial number in there. We'll exit out of this file. And next, what we need to do after we configured that, we need to go ahead and restart the Windows service for the UBHSM. So let's open up our services panel. And then we're going to have to scroll all the way to the bottom to get to the UBHSM connector service. And we'll go ahead and start that up. And that should auto restart after the machine starts up, depending on, by default it should. Next, what we need to do is modify the firewall rules. This is only necessary if you're connecting from connecting to the HSM from a remote system. So what we're going to do, we see there that the UBHSM is not listed there, so we're not going to be able to access it. So we will go ahead and allow another application and find that binary file. The way that we find it is going to be in the program files directory. Scroll down to UBHSM connector and just click on that service there. At this point, you just add it in and you'll see that it's listening in on the private interface. So you're good to go there. So everything underneath the private networks, it should allow you to see this. All right. So once we have the firewall set up, next we need to test it from a remote system. First thing I need to do is get the IP address of this surface. And now I'm going to bring in my shell window. I'm remote desktoped into the Windows box and from my Mac. So what you're seeing here is a shell screen from my Mac. And I'm on the Whale machine over SSH, and I am going to type in the IP address of the Surface Pro with the IP address, or the port number 3333, and the connection should work just fine. Once we open up that session, and we should be able to get a list of all of the objects that are on it. Now, keep in mind this is a Windows installation. There may be some other properties that you're going to have to modify. Again, if you're trying to test just to see if the connection is working, if the HSM is listening, I'm testing it from remote to the Surface Pro. But if that doesn't work for you, the next step would be to try to connect to it locally. To do that, there was another file that was in that SDK for the UBHSM shell. If you install that, you'll be able to run the same commands here for the UBHSM shell from the PowerShell on the Windows box, on the Surface box, and then use 127.0.0.1 3333, and it should respond. So with that, we will move on to the next install.